my eyes and dream about a world gone by. Time stood still from sea to sea, between red earth and blue sky. Eagles soar from mountains high.
Welcome, everyone. This is Arts-Based Methods for Social Justice-Oriented Evaluation as part of the T.R.A.I.N program hosted by Mass Culture. I'm Sharmalene Mendis-Millard. I'm your host today, and we're joined by a lovely panel of evaluators and researchers who have a lot to share with you. So I will begin, though, by just giving thanks for the fact that we are together here, that we are in relationship and in friendship, and that we have the chance to learn from and with each other. And I hope that what we share with you today is inspiring and motivates you to try something in your own work as artists or as people within the arts community. I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Neutral and Anishinaabe peoples on the Haldimand Tract, which is otherwise known as Kitchener-Waterloo region along the Grand River. And my ancestors are from Sri Lanka. So I'm indigenous to Sri Lanka. My family is anyway. And we are the Sinhalese people from there. So I welcome all of you, and I will introduce everyone here before we dive into our topic for today. So I'll hand things over to you, Anne-Marie, and welcome and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sharmalene. So kway everyone. I'm Anne-Marie. I'm a two-spirit Ilnue, that is mixed blood African Nova Scotian First Nation Mi'kmaq from the territory of Mi'kma'ki, and we're the people of the Eastern Door. And I come to you today from the lands of the Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I'm very grateful to be welcomed to this lands, and I support the people of these territories in resistance and in land back and self-determination and sovereignty. I guess I could describe myself. These identifiers are not only who I am, but I also dictate how I navigate in the settler nation state currently known as Canada, as I am Indigenous to Turtle Island and Mother Africa. Who I am is historical, political, economic, and social, yet Afro-Indigenous peoples in this settler nation state have been erased like so much of nativeness and the continued subjugation of Blackness. I do not see myself reflected in education texts, mainstream media, religion, or in a society that is dominated by white supremacist ideology, even though we have existed on these lands for over 500 years and since time immemorial. So mixed blood Indigenous Black communities have been recognized in the settler nation state of the US for hundreds of years, but do not hold the same recognition in Canada. So we're kind of erased from settler memory. Yet it is known through our stories that Black and Indigenous peoples form relationships on this land in the face of white colonial oppression to survive. Given the white settler state propensity towards hierarchies and scales, with white people being on top, of course, and it's very difficult for them to classify Afro-Indigenous peoples on the racial ladder. So a lot of the work that I do is around Afro-Indigeneity and what it means to exist on these settler colonial lands.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Maya and Jennica, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Lefkowich. I'm half a partnership and implementation with Jennica. We're joining you from Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I've been here about 7 years and continue to learn so much about this place. And one of the things that we're really excited to talk about in our arts-based chat is how wisdom sits in place. And there's a lot of assumptions around arts and how we bring arts into projects when really arts have always been part of the land systems and nature systems where we exist. And it's just about understanding kind of the legacy of where creative practice comes from and being able to honor where we come from, who's come before, and then setting up for success for everybody who's going to be creative after. So we're going to have some fun conversation about building arts through a sustainable lens. So we're setting next generations of evaluators up for creativity and curiosity while also honoring who came before us, because there's a relationship there. Certainly no one who is an evaluator is going to be the very first one to come into a place and be like, let's get creative, because there's lots of creative energy that's allowed us to get to this place. So we're really excited to have a chat about that and learn more about Anne-Marie and and have some like cross dialogue and just being curious nerds together. So thanks to everybody who's joining from wherever you're joining from.
I'm excited to engage in the conversation. So we should just, I think, jump in.
The first question I'll ask all of you is a big, meaty one. What does equity mean to you, and especially in the context of evaluation and research?
So what does equity mean to me in research as far as arts-based methods? I guess I'll start by saying that I do understand that we are at different stages of our journeys in understanding the implications and necessary work required to uproot systems of white supremacy and colonialism and capitalism and racism, because these are systems that seek to oppress us, and arts-based methods are one way that we can clap back against that as resistance. And given the history, it has been difficult in my work. We don't find anything about Indigenous Black experiences in the settler nation state. Our history has been denied, but there's blood memory and oral tradition that exists within our communities. And so we use arts-based methods as a way to give voice to that, because our ancestors are strong, we are strong, and we continue to see through the quagmire that is white supremacy in all of its arms. So we use art-based methods for that. So as far as equity goes, I also understand that those who benefit most from the systems of white supremacy are also the ones who should be dismantling it, and a worldview shift what equity looks like. So still in 2023, we find that doing equity work falls on the shoulders of Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples in doing work that supports everyone. And so this is not sustainable in its current form. When I witnessed white supremacy in action with the so-called Freedom Convoy, when I witnessed drag shows and drag storytelling as attacked by cishet white people, and when I witnessed an attempted supplantation of white supremacists in attempting to take over school boards and regional council, I know that we as Indigenous, Black, and racialized, Two-Spirit, transgender, queer, and disabled folks are going to continue experiencing violence and death on these lands. So, we're witnessing the destruction of our Earth Mother right before our very eyes. Those who benefit most from capitalist and neoliberal systems seem to be very short-sighted, selfish, and greedy. If we look at, the dish with one spoon treaty, we find that there are some who are taking more than they need. They're not taking what they need, they take too much, and so others suffer. It's uncompassionate. And we're also witnessing a cishet patriarchy that rules for most of this world and leading us to our destruction, and we're heading into a time of fascism that appears to be a runaway train. There's a lot going on. And it seems like as we push back with arts-based methods and having voices lifted that actually speak to our experiences, the pushback becomes even greater. But these are some of the reasons why I do arts-based research, because we need to understand what's happening in our world. Arts-based methods provide a way to reimagine a better world, a fair world, an equitable world, a just world. As part of my work in using arts-based methods, there's a principle of hope and healing. So people in my community, we've continued to suffer at the hands of white men, manifesting not only as intergenerational traumas, but the purposeful assimilation and annihilation of who we are, because we have access to coveted resources and because we can provide enslaved labor for the prison industrial complex. As a clear component of an arts-based method, healing is necessary as part of a critical consciousness raising. Within an arts-based method, the ones that I use in digital oral storytelling, we can begin to understand the systems that seek to oppress us, and we can resist those who seek to destroy Mother Earth. So resistance is hope and it is healing. And that's why I exclusively use arts-based methods such as digital oral storytelling in my work.
That's interesting that you exclusively use arts-based methods. So you don't use interviews, you don't use surveys or focus groups, or do you, and you incorporate arts-based methods within that? And to be clear, arts-based methods means without numbers or words necessarily, right? It's a creative expression. How would you describe that in general? And how do you incorporate that into your research?
So if we look at arts-based methods from a Western perspective, which I do not because I'm in a critical Indigenous researcher, we look at the work of perhaps Margaret Kovach and Sean Wilson and how we modify and use stories that, considered interviews or focus groups in a more Western sense, but they can be modified in a way to be used in Indigenous methodologies because they put the person first. So it's not about the researcher per se, but it's about the storytelling of in conversation or sharing circles about the people who are giving us their gifts as data in a Western sense. And so, I wouldn't say I don't use focus groups and interviews if I was looking at a Western perspective, but in having conversations and co-creating knowledge as part of an arts-based method, you could use those technical terms in a kind of way, but I like to think of conversations and sharing circles as a way to co-create knowledge with community members with whom I work.
I love it. Thank you for clarifying that. That's great, Anne-Marie. We'll get back to digital storytelling in a minute. I'll pass the baton over to Maya and Jennica to answer the question, what does equity in evaluation mean to you, and what can it mean?
One of I think the really important points that Anne-Marie brought up is that there's different work that goes into being creative work. It doesn't come easily. It requires joy. It requires being replenished in order to create, and then some boundaries around creation, so it doesn't go from being creative for creative sake into the productivity capitalist white supremacy land. And so there's different responsibilities involved. So like I'm a white queer Jewish person, but I'm a person who benefits from systems of white supremacy and capitalism. We're all messy at the end of the day. We have lots of intersecting things. And so as somebody who experiences privilege through systems of white supremacy, as Anne-Marie was mentioning, like there is a responsibility if I engage with these techniques to do some of that dismantling work. So one of the things that's really interesting to me around arts-based methods is how to do that dismantling work and not in a virtue signaling, I do arts, therefore I'm an equitable person, but like, what does the dismantling actually look like in terms of a day-to-day responsibility? So some of the questions that Jennica and I grapple with in our arts-based practices, when we show up in decision-making spaces, and as evaluators, we're privileged to do that because we do a lot of the strategic planning work, a lot of the reflection work. So when we are in these spaces of decision-making and reflection, whose experiences are we inviting into that room? And how can we make space for not just that tokenistic, let's make sure we tick a box for our grantor, but how do we make sure that people are showing up in an authentic way? And so figuring out tools that people can express themselves and then be honored in decision-making spaces is one way that we explore arts, especially for folks who, don't want to come to a table with a bunch of decision makers in the C-suite of very fancy titles to say, this is my experience. How will you engage with that? Because that's not necessarily going to be a safe way. One thing we'll talk about collage, so being able to invite a little bit of a subversive lens into our practice. So echoing the actual like physical dismantling work of breaking down structures of oppression, we can do that symbolically and in little steps with breaking down materials that have been used historically to harm people and bring new meaning into it. And also create spaces for people to share things that are none of my business. And as an evaluator, it's really important for me to know when it's my job to facilitate and kind of help people bring their expression into play and when, that's not my place. And I can absolutely just step back and know that that's not for me. Just because I've helped to facilitate a process doesn't mean it's any of my business. And arts are a great place to invite some nuance where we can do some activities together and we can center the audience who wants to know. And it often isn't going to be me because I don't know anybody whose creative practice is like, oh, I really want the evaluator to be able to know what this means. For me, it's a practice of knowing when I can actually just step back, like open a door and step back and say, great, let's all chat. I will be here if you need me. And if you don't, that's cool, because sometimes having a white person in the space is the fastest way to absolutely shut down a conversation. And so we can all go sit in the hall and wait for coffee.
Thank you so much, Maya. And I do like the recognition too that there's one thing to facilitate processes where we can ask people to reflect upon whatever it is. So let's say I'm a performer and we want to know how did the audience engage with our performance, or what is it that they're taking away? Providing the opportunity to show up authentically and share whatever people want to share. And then there's who's actually recording that, quote unquote, and who is then making sense of it, of all of the information shared, and then what is actually shared with whom. So it's not like, we can have all kinds of things that are shared, but not everything needs to be shared or witnessed. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Jennica, do you want to add anything to that?
If you're an artist, I think the thing I've been thinking about is like that evaluation should feel good and the measurement should feel meaningful. And I don't know if artists know that enough. And like what, as an evaluator, to me, that's the thing I would most want to get across, is that evaluation should be a process where you learn too. And if the evaluator you've hired or the funder isn't doing that, it's like pushing back on that would be kind of where one place of where equity sits. And then if you're an evaluator, I know at least personally, it's like you have to grapple with the fact that the field hasn't done a lot of work engaging in equity. So the training that you have lacks it. So you really have to seek it as an evaluator. For me, as like a white evaluator who does get privilege and who's learned through the education system, like I've always been good at math, and that's like celebrated, where you don't have to like justify, like I'm going to come in and do like an analysis using numbers. People are like, okay. If you say I'm going to use art as a way to learn, people are like, what? And you get a lot of resistance. So I hope that's also something we can talk about a little bit, is like, if you're an artist here, like how do you use that in your evaluative work that you're doing? Because you're learning and you're doing accountability in the organizations that you're running. And I hope that some of the conversations we have today, like if you're watching, you can take one of these things and try them. Like, I hope that we get that in this conversation. So those were some thoughts I was having.
The privileging of positivist approach. So how do we understand the world? If we can't see it, it doesn't exist, or if we can't measure it, it's not valued. That's one way of thinking about things that has been privileged in the past. And even as a social scientist, that's my training, qualitative methods and the way of being able to embed yourself in a community and learn through just showing up at events and being part of community volunteer initiatives and learning through those processes. I've personally had a lot of pushback on how valid that is. And so I tend to think of the difference between qualitative methods and quantitative methods as qualitative, provides you with rich narratives, depth, understanding, nuance through words, and I tend to put arts-based methods within the qualitative bucket. I could be completely wrong, but that's how I generally think of it. And you can think in terms of what's credible instead of what's valid. That's to me how I would see qualitative methods, whereas quantitative methods, we can take anything and make sense of it through numbers in different ways. And in general, quantitative methods are trying to get at more generalizations or give you indicators of things. But to me, each method has assumptions that underlie them and have benefits and limitations. And it's just looking at one piece of the puzzle and different ways of looking at the same phenomena, if you will. So if we're thinking of people who are wanting to learn how to use evaluation or engage with it so that they're able to write grant applications or be able to communicate and articulate what they're doing, their objectives, outcomes of their work to the public, to funders. That's the kind of awareness building that I'm hoping our series generates, is different ways of doing that. And also so that people understand that, yes, there's lots of people who are trained in it. There's a field, there's different facets of that field, just like with any kind of research. It's a research for a specific purpose, like actually assessing something according to certain criteria and whether it's quote unquote good or bad or what it means. But it's not something that's people can't engage in. We evaluate things all the time as human beings, whether or not to go outside, whether to make this recipe or that. We have the evaluation capabilities within us. So it's often I hear people say, oh, I can't do evaluation. I need to hire somebody. And yes, absolutely hire somebody if you'd like, but you also can do it yourself and at least engage in some of the process yourself, and not to take away from evaluation consultants at all. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just wanting to let people know that you can be empowered to be involved in evaluation and help to guide it. Use the methods yourselves. That's my own personal feeling. As consultants, I wonder, Maya and Jennica, you might have a different opinion on that, but how do you feel about the public's general knowledge of evaluation and how they can and cannot be engaged in it?
I know for us, our goal is always to work ourselves out of a job. At the end of the day, we should have systems of evaluation in our work. I think the reality is that it doesn't often exist. And I do think there's some steps you have to start with. Like, for example, like for me in evaluation, you have to start with what's the question? Way before you know what your tools are, who you're going to engage, what respect looks like, what reciprocity, like none of that exists until you have a question. So like, yes, ideally, I think evaluation should be done by people in the group. And at minimum, you should guide the one that's part of your organization. I think you start with the question and you go from there. And if you need help, the right consultant can help out.
One thing that we often see is a lot of grant givers and funders have a lot of expectation on their grant recipients, like folks who are receiving funds, that they have to do all of this extra work in order to keep and sustain and get more funding, and sort of fueling that another layer of inequity in the capitalist system. Is like we work with a lot of 1 to 2 person arts and community organizations who like are already doing hard enough work and are already on the front lines of trying to like innovate and build community and keep their finger on the pulse of what's wanted, and then adapt what they have to, serve. And so one thing that we're trying to learn more about and be aware of is part of that evaluation cycle is extra labor for folks who are already working really hard, because funders are like, please, if you're gonna get this money, you have to do this large, extensive grant application cycle that kind of gives a lot of data back to funders, but isn't useful necessarily, because everybody writes a stressful report to say we're going to promise the world, even though we know it's not feasible because we're only 2 people and we've got a lot of stuff to get done in 6 to 8 months. And then there's an expectation that you report back on how that money was spent. And evaluation sometimes comes in as a tool of reporting back to the funder, as opposed to promoting accountability with the community partners that you're trying to do good work with, or artistic partners to understand how you've been able to create and hold space. And so one thing that we're trying to just deal with in a very real way is evaluation has been used.
Bad evaluation. It's bad evaluation. Like
bad evaluation that is serving the funding cycle as opposed to the learning cycle, which is what it's meant to. So from like the consultant perspective, is we often come in at the moment where somebody's like, we have to report back help. And we're like, but how do we also like, yes, because we never want to get in the way of somebody's money. And also, how do we like shift a little bit so that there can still be some space for learning and growth? And it isn't just like, this is how dollars were spent, please give us more, because that doesn't really serve anybody. How do we start to shift that? So it's not just accountability to dollars, but it's like accountability for learning and growth and doing more good stuff.
There's utilization focus, there's the fidelity one, did you do what you said you were going to do, versus developmental, where you might make changes along the way, et cetera, process evaluation, outcome evaluation, impact evaluation. There's all the different types meant to give you some kind of guidance for answering the type of question that you have. Anne-Marie, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts along the lines of this conversation about the purpose of evaluation or research that can benefit organizations, communities, and maybe you'd want to expand more on the principles that you were talking about before, and also who gets to own that data, or where does that go? What kinds of sovereignty issues should we be aware of and thinking of, that kind of thing. So do you have any thoughts along those lines?
We think about arts-based methods. Like, where did they originate? Did they originate in North America? Like people may wanting to believe. We think about Indigenous communities around the world that actually created arts-based methods to resist against the status quo, against dominant narrative. I kind of want to touch on what Maya was talking about in whose knowledge actually matters, and what does that look like when you're doing research, or if you're doing an evaluation, like what does that really look like? because we operate under the premise that Western knowledge is superior knowledge. And we want to work in communities and think about the deficit of the communities or the deficit of the community organization, and framing it in a way that speaks to a hierarchy of humanists where, Western knowledge is considered superior and Indigenous knowledge would be considered myth or lore until, they discover something. And then it's like, oh, well, we've known this for thousands of years through our traditions of storytelling. When you're operating in a nonprofit or looking at arts community and doing an evaluation, like what knowledge is going to be brought to the fore here? And how is that knowledge going to raise a critical consciousness? Because I believe that it has to be a necessary component of what we do. If we're not doing the work for the betterment of existing on these lands, because I'm not going to center humans in all of this, it's the land that we really need to focus upon, how we navigate on land and the protection of water and air and all of that, then what does it all matter? If you require funding for something, it's almost like you have to write it in a Western knowledge kind of a way. And that's why I also like that word that you used earlier, Maya, about being subversive in a sense that, yes, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're going to do, which might not necessarily be the same thing. But if we're going to elevate the knowledge of the people with whom we're working, then it has to be that kind of a way. If we were always looking to hold up Western ways of being and knowing, then it's not going to work.
So Anne-Marie, maybe at this point, would you like to share a bit about what digital storytelling is, how you got interested in it as a method, and some examples of how you would use it and with whom?
I'll mention then the Proclaiming Our Roots project that I have been working with the community around Northern Turtle Island since coming to these lands. And really, it's just a project where we share our stories to combat against the erasure of Afro-Indigenous peoples on these lands. The many Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers that, I'm very grateful to be able to have learned from, it's that the telling of our stories is a way to resist against the dominant narrative and to restory the dominant narrative, that our stories have been squashed for so long. Indigenous Black racialized stories have been squashed for so long that we don't really matter. And so in digital oral storytelling, it's basically, we share our stories, we share our experiences, our lives, our realities, how we look at the world, put it in a more technological form. So we use videos as a way where community members create their own stories. So they're able to put in maybe some pictures that they have. They can tell and talk about where they came from and how they came to be on these lands. So by telling the stories around geographies, we push against borders as resistance, settler borders that have been established, but not really the borders of the people of these lands who have been oppressed. And so they create the stories, they put music to the stories, they tell their stories in a technological kind of form. So for us, it's just their stories, and they exist on a website, the Proclaiming Our Roots website. And the point of that is so that peoples around the world who have access to technology can see that we are resisting and we are fighting against our erasure and reclaiming back and being connected to the land. We have actually connected from many peoples around the world, in the US and Australia and different places like that. We're resisting together because it's not just happening here in Canada. Resistance to global domination is happening all around the world.
So if somebody wanted to contribute to that or be involved and participate, Anne-Marie, how would they go about doing that?
We use our community members as connections, and we put out calls to various Afro-Indigenous communities around Northern Turtle Island. We're heading up north next, and we're heading out west. There's actually some contact information on the proclaimingourroots.com website. If someone was interested, just send us an email and we'll be in touch.
That's fantastic. So in this project, you have some goals of resistance and reclaiming stories and making them visible, do you have any ways in which you assess, okay, we're doing things to encourage people to do that, or we're having the intended outcomes? Do you have any assessment process like that, or is it not part of your project?
It's just interesting. I hear words like intended outcomes and best practices.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. But I mean, this is how we speak, right? As researchers, as evaluators, we use these words to determine that, our work actually has an impact. And so I guess I would just say that because critical consciousness raising is a necessary component of this arts-based method, we can evaluate in seeing what people in our Proclaiming Our Roots community continue to do and have done in resisting and promoting their identities and fighting back against the erasure. That's one way that we could, I guess, assess if the project is actually, I don't even like to say working, because it's not about that. It's just, if our voices are being raised and we are pushing back against our erasure and saying, hey, we are here, then I feel like we have accomplished what we're doing. And the whole point is to expand this, as I said, across Canada into other Indigenous communities around the world and what that looks like for them. But being aware of the systems that seek to oppress, being aware of how these systems work and the people who uphold these systems and what that looks like for us, not only just to survive, but, and hoping that our children and our children's children will have a thriving life, is really beautiful to witness as I see this unfolding throughout the project. I could say technically, I have collected data and, written some various things, but that's not the point of the project.
And Maria, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about the process of putting the stories together. Digital storytelling is very diverse. So I was just curious, how do people come up with the stories? What went into it?
We brought in someone who has a lot of knowledge around the process. So it's not like as researchers, we did this all ourselves. We brought in people who know how to do digital oral storytelling. We had some pre-gatherings prior to coming together on the land. So letting community members know, think about things that you might want to include in your story. So is there any music that has meaning to you? Are there any pictures are there any sounds? Is there anything at all that you would like to include in the process? And then when we came together, we shared a lot just within ourselves about who we are and our experiences and things of that nature. And then we set to storyboarding. So the facilitator led us into what the story would look like through a storyboard process. And we provided the technical parts like the iPads, and we used iMovie to create. And so we were able to bring all of these images and sounds together and learn how to overlay. We learned about the Ken Burns effect, things like that. And then another beautiful thing about the process was after the digital oral stories were created, we had a viewing amongst ourselves, and then we launched them in our various communities. And so there were community launches where people in the community could just come. So we had some food and we hosted in maybe a local community space, a community theater, and we just all came together and shared about being proud of what the community members had created. And it was wonderful to see, some of my friends even came as oh, there's where I'm from. And, we've known that we've been Afro-Indigenous, for hundreds of years, but we never really talked about it. So we saw critical conscious raising as well in the community members who came to witness the beautiful storytelling of the community members and proclaiming our roots.
In arts-based techniques, there's lots of complicated conversations that have to happen about ownership of who owns art and consent, because once you share something in a community setting, you can't unsee something. I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about how you navigated consent and ownership of the videos, because classic moment of once you create art, it's no longer yours. It kind of goes out into the world. And I'm just curious how you had those conversations.
We did have very fruitful conversations about that and what it means. And, some community members decided to keep them stories for themselves, and that was fine because it's their stories. The stories are their stories. And so the people who put their digital stories onto the website own the stories, but also share the stories.
It's an exciting project. We'll definitely encourage people to check those out. And even just seeing your smile, Anne-Marie, of how it made you feel to see those videos in those moments in community, I think that speaks to the value to you and to the people that were there, right? It just speaks to how wonderful this process was.
Thank you. And maybe I'll just add that sometimes, when we do this work, we plant the seeds, and the tree grows. We might not see the tree when it brings on its lovely leaves, but we know that we've planted something good. We may not always see the end result, but we know that this project has become a grassroots movement in a sense of promoting our identities and who we are. And whatever, form or shape that takes on, we've planted those seeds and they will grow and they will spread all over. And so that's part of it. Maybe not always seeing the fruits of our labor, but just knowing that the seeds are planted for generations to come, to me, is good for my soul, good for my heart.
That's lovely. Before we move on, just for those who don't know the term, could you please explain what critical consciousness is? Like when you say critical consciousness, awareness raising, what is it that you're really meaning?
That comes from Paulo Freire and popular education. It's a whole pedagogy of hope in just reimagining a more just world, a more equitable world. And one of the components of that, I kind of explained it as I was going through, but not naming it, was education as a key part of understanding how our world works. It has been that colonialism, imperialism is very good at being in the shadows and operating almost as a puppet master and how we live our daily lives. So in understanding how these systems and the people who uphold these systems affect us in our daily lives, it's like those aha moments when you realize that, wow, all of the stuff that I didn't know before and how it's been affecting my life now provides a vehicle. It provides language and understanding why we suffer without actually knowing why we suffer. So it provides language for that, provides an revealing of how things operate in our world, and also how we can use what we learn to resist against it in the protection of our children and generations to come, and protection with the land and connecting with the land. All of these things that colonialism has put upon us in disconnecting us from the land. Critical consciousness allows us to understand and connect again. So very grateful for Freire and those who follow the popular education model and bringing that to us. And Indigenous scholars and Black feminist scholars as well, in showing us the subterfuge and the way that things operate that we can't even see, that affect us on our daily lives. So
thank you so much. It is, once you understand something from a different perspective, or like you say, it gives you language, it's a way of viewing the world, then it helps make sense of the world when you have that kind of knowledge.
And
so
how
thank
to
you.
resist against it. There's an action component as well. If we know, we can't not resist. Right? Once you know it, once you see it, you can't unknow it. And so for the sake of, a better world, resistance is part of that. Fighting back is part of that.
I'll pass it over to Maya and Jennica now to please share your thoughts on the arts-based methods that you use. Specifically, today we'll talk about photography and collage, but I know you have some examples and things to share, so I'll turn it over to you.
We're talking today about using photography as a way to gather information and cue different ways of thinking about things. So when we're talking here about photo elicitation, what we mean is using a photo and then pairing it with either an interview or a group discussion to unpack what that photo is. And then you use that information to guide some decision-making and thinking about how programs work. So as an example of this, Maya and I last year had the privilege of getting to evaluate an organization that was running a program to build kind of professional skills of gender diverse youth, kind of getting ready to launch either their own businesses and stuff like that.
So we were just curious to understand, like, in a professional program that was looking to launch young people, like, what does that actually mean? Like, where do they want to be launched to? How would that kind of get them to where they want to go? And so we wanted to start with, like, what do young people see for themselves in this next phase of their life? And it was really key for us to phrase this as a want, because so much of research and evaluation comes from like this deficit framing of what is needed. And we wanted to really just understand, like, young people are very capable, they're very sassy, and they know exactly what they want. Whether or not it's what they need, okay, that's fine, but like not my place. So we wanted to understand like what is driving them and like what is interesting and exciting in this next phase. So we asked them to take a picture of what their professional ambition kind of means to them. And it was great because young people were not interested in doing another survey. And believe me, we were not interested in making them sit down and do one. We wanted to kind of tap into some abstract and metaphorical meaning. So for a lot of folks that we were doing some pre-consultations with, they were like, it feels like it's close but far away. And it's kind of hard to put their finger on the pulse of like, what actually is my career going to be? And when you're 18 years old, like that is a tough question. So we thought, okay, if we pair a knowledge system that's around images and metaphors with something that already feels a little bit abstract, then we're tapping into the knowledge that they already have, which is kind of abstract and they haven't experienced it yet. They're launching their careers. They haven't been in them. There's a parallel between the method and the kind of wisdom we were trying to understand. And this is something that Jennica and I do a lot of work around, is like, how do you pair the right method with a kind of wisdom? Because there's lots of different arts and there's lots of different ways of knowing. And it's just about like finding the right pathway in. And so this is an example of one story that came out where I had done an interview with this young person who was saying, you know, my professional experience is like this purple donut. And they were saying, I can't really understand like where I'm going to go, but I know that I would like to be fancy and I'd like to walk into a room and be taken seriously, because you would never walk past this purple donut without doing a double take and being like, oh, hello, saucy donut. And then they leaned in at some point and said, you know, but the secret of this donut is it's cream filled. And all I really want to be is fulfilled, but I would rather have that just for me. And I'll know that. And nobody else has to know that. And that's okay. And so we were able to then talk to this program and say, okay, these are the kinds of stories that we're hearing from young people about where they are, where they'd like to be. And so we were able to use this metaphor to help structure some learning around the social emotional learning, like what contributes to that cream base, that's the fulfilling piece, and not have it drip off the counter, but there's still a structure. So like, then how do we actually do the dough? Like, what are the kinds of skills that are going to contain it? So when a person walks into the room, they feel like they are being taken seriously. That's sort of how this one came together. It was a fun process. Like it invited some playfulness and fun, that we got a bunch of metaphors back instead of Likert scales on a scale of 1 to 10. How prepared are you for this next step? We instead got a lot of food metaphors. Also, a key point is not to do these maybe around lunchtime. I don't know if that was some hunger balls, but also just, you know, people have an appetite. It makes total sense.
What I love about this too is that it really taps into the creative part of your brain and thinking in terms of metaphors, and it helps to make the conversation fun, but also tangible in a way. Like if you're thinking about the dough that holds things together, or I was at a conference recently where we were talking about flood maps as a hamburger. And so what are the things that you absolutely need versus what are all the toppings that you might want to have, and that different people want different toppings. Anyway, it actually made sense in the moment, because we realized, okay, there are things that we want to have consistent across Canada, so-called Canada, and there are some things that maybe this community wants that community doesn't want or need. So I do personally, I can resonate with the metaphors. It's just a fun way of thinking, and it's so much more creative than the usual questionnaire. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Anne-Marie, Do you have any thoughts about this type of method and what was shared?
I love photo elicitation and photo voice as ways in particular to engage youth. From a technical point, I guess it's using your phone as an example to be able to take pictures and to record what you're thinking on a voice memo. I love the simplicity yet complexity of it. I'm going to be exploring this more as a way of thinking about engagement with youth in particular.
And when we're thinking about equity, if we're thinking of equity in terms of fairness, who has access to what resources, nowadays that people do have, generally people have phones or they have somebody they know who have phones. It's an accessible way. It's a way that just anyone can use it. And that's, to me, when I'm thinking of equity and evaluation, it's just making it so that everyone has their own expertise and everyone can participate and contribute and guide. To me, that's what equity is in evaluation. And so to make it less barriers to being able to just to engage in the way that they want to, not necessarily in the way that one person or a team of people might envision. So it's, I don't know who shared this with me. It's not the golden rule, it's the platinum rule. Maybe it was him and Sophia from Reciprocal Consulting, but the platinum rule or the diamond rule, or I'm not sure what, but it's the idea that it's not that we want to treat other people the way that we would want to be treated, but we treat other people in the way that they want to be treated and they want to engage. So it's a better rule than the golden rule. Anyway, thank you so much for that.
I just wanted to add that there are a couple of variations of this technique. So when thinking about equity and who has access, so in this case, we had asked people to take a photo, but there was some variation there. So we also said if a phone is not accessible or camera is not accessible, you could bring a stock image, tear out a page from a magazine, use what is available. Another thing is if that is not available or it creates like some discomfort, especially if you're doing this in a group discussion where some people come up with a phone and some people don't, and it invites this, especially with young people where there's a lot of attention paid to who has and who doesn't have in the same space at the same time. Another variation is that the evaluator or the researcher could bring a number of photos to the space and then folks choose from those photos. So you pose a question that you want to explore through metaphor, and then people get to choose from existing images. The limitation is, of course, that you can't invent from your own way of thinking about that question because the photos are pre-selected. So, bringing enough variation that there's lots of different ways that people can read into a metaphor. So that is another choice. So if phones aren't accessible to everybody or the means of taking a photo isn't accessible to everybody, then, you can always just bring the photos and have people choose in that moment instead of everybody has to then deal with who brought a magazine clip out versus a photo on their phone. And I also just want to briefly kind of tapping onto what Anne-Marie said, there's a little bit of a difference between photo voice and photo elicitation. So these are two different buzzwords you're hearing for the first time. Photo elicitation is what I just talked about. It's the self-contained, you pose a question, photo is used to unpack meaning, and then through some sort of discussion, whether it's a formal interview or an informal conversation or a sharing circle, meaning is generated through the use of that image. Photo voice has this element plus on either end of that technique that's typically a structure is put in place in service of social change. And so there's more involved in sharing power, setting that, what is the question you're exploring or whose goal? Typically there's a community advisory board involved in setting that expectation and arriving at the decision to use photos. And then the ways in which meaning is unpacked is used in service of social change with the goal of transforming something, and both the process and then how that knowledge is going to be used at the end and throughout the process is for social change. So we sometimes hear people say, I did a photo voice project and it was photo elicitation and there was nothing transformative or power sharing about it. So just like any other method, you can absolutely be exploitative and reinforce power differences and, not be in service of equity doing this. And being an evaluator showing up with a camera, assuming it's a good choice, is the fastest way to not do equity while using art.
Did you ever think about maybe lending somebody an iPad so they could go out and take a picture?
Yes, Jennica, I know, has a lot of thoughts on that of, yes, absolutely. If there's budget available to kind of, blend or to do that? Absolutely. And also some thoughtfulness around like if there's any safety concerns.
Any method across all of them require thoughtfulness. Like if you're going to do photo voice, you still have to be thoughtful about who has access and where, and, you know, is this the right method for this group? Absolutely. And I think all the questions, like, is an iPad yes or bad? Like all of those things, like it can be something very small. Like this is a really cool tool if you're working at your arts organization and you can't quite name, like, what do you hope happens this next year? This can be a really fun activity that doesn't have to be formal, like where we're talking here of collecting data and stories. You can do it just as your organization as a way to learn, right? And kind of set some goals for the coming year. I just wanted to highlight that too. You can do it informally and it can be a conversation tool.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I realized I didn't have a good understanding of the difference between photo voice and photo elicitation. I didn't quite realize the intent behind photo voice. I'm just wondering if you might be able to just give an example of how photo voice might be used for social change. Like what could that look like?
I was thinking about a photo voice project done by a colleague who was looking at patient healthcare person interactions and what that looks like. The patients used photo voice to share with those who were supposed to be providing support to them what their experiences were like, because they weren't really being listened to just in talking, you know, verbally. And so they used photo voice as a project to share their thoughts and concerns and their experiences with their healthcare providers and what that looked like. And it actually did make a difference in transforming the way, in a smaller setting, like a smaller hospital, in the way that healthcare providers and the people that they serve, how they interact and how they receive their healthcare.
Exactly what I love about it. It's a great way to have a conversation. I've done one where we were street involved youth and wanted to talk about what kind of service did they want for a drop-in center. You getting to talk about what worked and what didn't and what they would do if they were the boss. And the conversations were just like so powerful because like it's just things you would never have thought of. And what was really cool is at the end when you asked, what do you guys want to do? How do you want to talk to the community? They wanted to host an art exhibit at the drop-in center. So they got to pick the picture, see it blown up, have like an artist statement, be the tour guides around. And it was a great way to have positive conversations because one of the things the community was lacking was positive interactions with street involved youth. So they had such negative stereotypes. And here now they could see that they're people and we could connect on a human level. And the community was able to find better ways to connect in and work together as people all sharing this space. And it was a really like beautiful thing to watch and like see people getting to tell their stories, and the confidence and smiles that come out of that just feels so lovely. It's a very lovely method if you have the time and energy. Like you have to be in community. The questions come not from you, but from what that group wants and needs. And you have to have the flexibility and time, resources, and willingness to let the project evolve, which is much smaller than photo elicitation, which is more like we're going to ask one question and it might take 1 hour. You know what I mean? It's a much different scale commitment. It's also much more powerful, but you know, you got to do it responsibly.
I love how you said how powerful stories are. You know, telling stories can be transformative and of themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, what do people actually remember? Do you remember the recommendations from a report, or do you remember a story that within that has lessons? How would you actually teach something to a child or to myself? I'll have to remember. I remember stories and what that lesson can teach me, whether it's a story from my past or something somebody's shared with me. So it's absolutely powerful and a way to touch us emotionally and engage with us and something that we can remember. Thank you so much for sharing those examples. And I would love to see that, see some examples too. I mean, even just the example you gave, Anne-Marie, of how to convey to someone how you felt and how not okay a situation was. How would you even take photos of that? I have no idea.
This is a crowd favorite and a Maya and I favorite, I have to admit. Like I didn't know I was going to fall in love with collage like as a method. And once we started doing it, I was like, this method is so cool. So I'm very excited to get to talk about it. So what collage is you basically take a bunch of paper materials. You can take like going through your recycling bin is a great opportunity of stuff. So we've done it at our own places, as well as if you're at an organization, kind of collecting various paper pamphlets, things like that, nothing living. You can definitely take like if a leaf has fallen on the ground, etc. And then you get a question in mind. And the goal is to rip up and tear and kind of break down the pieces and then reassemble them back on a piece of paper. And you're going to put them into conversation. So as an example, Maya and I did this as a way that we were doing our own evaluation planning. We run a company together and we were like, the thing about evaluation is that it's a practice, right? So who you are and how you think about it and what you do influence how you do evaluation. So when we were starting our work, we were like, how do we both practice evaluation? What are going to be the principles that we tell our clients that we're going to do and share our practice? So what we did is we asked ourselves, like, when you feel your best as an evaluator, how do you practice? And Maya and I created these things. We used the exact same materials so that we could kind of see what we did differently. We didn't see each other's. And really what's cool about it is you get to go into your sensory emotional feeling. Like you gotta, there's some things that both of us didn't like and you just rip it. You rip it and you throw it in the garbage and it feels wonderful. And other things that you can do is you can see what you're drawn to. And now when you want to put them on paper, how do you put them into conversation? So what are the relationships across different ideas?
I'd love to see what both of you cut out as common things like let's have coffee, community, balance, magic, and then other things that were different. It's really interesting.
In a variation, sometimes you get people to bring their own method, their own pieces of whatever, and gather their own supplies. In this case, we grabbed the same because we did want to kind of see exactly where there were connections and where we were very different. And so here, for example, one of the things that we did is we completed them and then we asked each other, like, for about 1 minute, can you tell me about your piece? And Maya and I heard each other, and then we got to explore, what about this? What does this mean here? Like, for example, we both had magic and community, and it was allowing a conversation to say, what does that look like? And then there was things like balance, right? Both of us had just been coming out of our PhDs, and what we wanted most in anything in our company was for it to be work-life balance. That was essential, right? We don't want to work and be spending the way that we had been living through the academy, which as grad students means you're there all the time. So it was cool to get to talk about both exactly what we had thought about the evaluation principles, but also more generally, like, how did we want to feel at work? And what were the relationships across different things? And it was a great kind of tool. And you can also use this to understand like how someone enjoyed your program or didn't enjoy it, or how do you think of a certain place or idea. And speaking for myself, like as a professional in professional spaces, like you don't get to have fun very often. So it can be a really nice opportunity for you and people you work with to kind of get into that play sense and learn some really interesting things. Or if you're a researcher and evaluator, you can get at really interesting information in a way that still is joyful and playful, and it's very fun.
Speaking of resistance, I would love to live in a world where being professional, being taken seriously also involves being human and loving and kind and caring and fun and silly and making mistakes and just being our whole selves. So, whether it's how we're supposed to dress or how we're supposed to, that's all dictated by this white supremacist colonial attitude. And so I embrace fully the fun, just full fun. And because we learn when we're having fun, when we heal and we laugh, like when we laugh, we are having fun and we're learning as well and we're connecting. So anyway, I just love this so much.
Yeah, so this is an interesting technique. As Jennica mentioned, there's a couple of distinct layers that become facilitators for meaningful conversation. So one is like, what materials do you choose? And in this case, we started from the same, we made a package, we both got the same, but we've done this in spaces where people go around their built environment and take free and allowed things from that in that space. And then we have a conversation of what kinds of images and representation come up. So for example, we did this with nursing students. They went around a hospital, they took all of the health pamphlets, and then through the deconstructing, like tearing things up, cutting, and the reconstructing, which can be like scrunching things or building. Like one limitation is when you take a picture of a collage, it doesn't actually do justice to what it was, because you can't really see the three-dimensional, how things are standing up or flipped over or layered. But nevertheless, there's the breaking things down into their component parts and then building them up. And in that, some of the meaning is transformed. So the materials mean different things and you can subvert them. So for example, in my collage, that corner that's cut, sort of separated by the puzzle pieces and that gold string and the words "now what," on the inside of that, with the content and the carrot and the business as usual, were all things I didn't want. These were all things that were very normal and found in these magazines that we were using that were like terrible, and I hated them. And so I put that there as like a reminder of what, if this is what feeling my best is, then what is it not? There's an opportunity for things to be transformed or to hold two meanings, what things are not. And there's also an opportunity to have a conversation of, we've taken all of our materials, we've put them in the collage, but what's left on the table? And so we talk a lot in our practice around like, what does the negative space mean as well? You know, to your question earlier on like, what is a picture that would represent a bad experience? Sometimes it's not necessarily that the bad experience is visualized, it's what is not present. And you can have a conversation on what is not coming into this space, or what are we not doing? So we had this kind of fun moment with our nursing students who were like, okay, well, we got into representation. What do people look like on these stupid pamphlets of like, what does illness look like and wellness, and who gets to be like our fitspiration, you know, ideals. And then they got to play with them and subvert them in a way of saying, okay, if we are going to use these images, and how can we use them in a way that speaks to us? If you're doing this in a group, what Jennica and I have found, and this has been our deep sadness of the pandemic, but we're really looking forward to doing this again in person, is in the group setting, it's like one sort of chaos multiplied by however many other people are sitting around the table. And then once one person spills and that nervous energy kind of erupts, then you get like symphony of creative energy of everybody tearing and spilling and being messy. And then there's the giggles that happen because somebody got glitter on somebody else's piece. And then those giggles kind of turn into side conversations. Like, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm doing that too. Oh, that's different. Oh, and people it's like this excitement. And so it's not just like, you know, Jennica and I usually don't care at all about what happens at the end. Like the product is like, don't care. It's really like what is happening while you're doing, because it's like, that's when you get the most like taste of humanity, of everybody's giggling, and it's that creative energy. And that's where some really interesting wisdom comes out of like, okay, so what's left on the table? Oh, nobody touched that piece. I guess we don't like that sort of, you know, or, oh, everybody's kind of engaging over here. Things are starting to build. So it's like, it's the kinds of knowledge that we don't often privilege because it doesn't fit nicely into a publication, and you absolutely can't tell your funder about the glitter. So it's like, but this is where the magic really is like all the stuff you can't really report on.
And it feels good. Like, I think one of the things for me is evaluation can feel good. It can be this, because it's a process of learning and checking in on the accountability that should be meaningful to you, right? If you're doing the things you hope you're doing, it's checking in on that. And to me, when evaluation can be like that, then this activity is now a way to like bond and have fun with people you work with and learn together. And like to me, that's what I'm hearing Amaya's talking, or what I've seen. It's kind of that like learning, and people are like, you know, making coffee dates for after work. And like, you know, it's just allowing people to be human and chat and share information. And we do then take the product and like talk about it, right? We have like we'll put them around the wall and everyone can like share and talk, and that wisdom can be co-created, and that goes into the report and stuff. And it's, as a evaluator, to get to facilitate that is one of like the great privileges of, for me, this getting to do this work is like, you get to like hear the stories and capture some of the wisdom and write it up and help the organization use and learn in a way that can honor and like build on. And, you know, when people like being at work, it's a better place. Like I can say that having the job I have now, like love working with Maya, it's great. It's way better than when I didn't like my job, you know? And I think for me, the best versions of evaluation and what makes me excited about the arts methods is allowing measurement to be both meaningful and like joyful.
I love it. And not only for accountability, but also that learning and excitement to then feed the inspiration for what comes next and what can we do now. And there's just so many uses of evaluation that don't necessarily get talked about. So yeah, thank you.
To point of the project is to resist. So resist colonial ways of knowing and being. So as you go through the website, it gives a little bit of history of the project, talks about who is part of the team on the project. But I will go to the digital stories, and we can see here, it gives a little blurb here about what digital stories are. So videos that layer image, video, voice, and text, sound, and music, as I explained before. But this story here, this is Rashida's story called Roots and Rivers by Rashida. And so I really love this story because it talks about being Indigenous to two lands. So when we had our pre-gatherings, Rashida went out and did some video taping with her daughter in being on the land. And while she was doing that, she talked about her ancestors from the west coast of Africa. She talked about her Indigenous ancestors on these lands in northern Turtle Island, but she made the connection between the two and talked about the connection to land, and really that for our own well-being as Afro-Indigenous people, the connection to land needs to be there. And the critical conscious raising of it is understanding that the purposeful disconnection from land to break the transmission of knowledge for Indigenous peoples that works towards promoting the colonial project and the predatory extraction of lands and assimilation for the larger colonial project on these lands. So Rashida's story was very good in bringing that forth and understanding that we need to get connected back to the land for our own health and healing and well-being. So it was a very beautiful story. Not half of anything but Wapakisis. This story in particular talks about what it's like to be an Afro-Indigenous person under colonial rules such as blood quantum and one-drop rules, and how we actually exist on these lands where some community members are kind of like have a double whammy of colonization, whereas, you know, theft of lands, disconnection from land, but also having ancestors who were enslaved and what that means to feed the capitalist machine. This is how it became a grassroots movement, by sharing, you know, beyond this land and to other Indigenous lands, and understanding the similarities in the colonial project, how theft of land is a necessary part of colonization, how assimilation is a necessary part of colonization, how annihilation of a peoples is necessary as part of colonization. So these stories share, and how our ancestors went through that, how we're still here as a people, and what that means for us going forward as resistance.
Thank you so much for sharing, Anne-Marie. Is there anything else you'd like to share about using these methods, the limitations, the pitfalls, the benefits, and anything else that you'd like to share?
Maybe I will just reiterate that arts-based methods, not coming from Western knowledge bases, is really an excellent way to engage people who are marginalized by various systems. And in community-based work, arts-based methods bring forth other ways of being and knowing. We don't just live on these lands in one kind of a way. There are many truths and many realities. There are many ways of how we come to know who we are and how we exist on these lands. And I really feel that arts-based methods really bring this to the fore in resisting and restoring against the dominant narrative that has to happen if we're going to continue to exist on these lands. We can take as many surveys as we want. We can, you know, crunch the numbers and do a linear regression, but that's not going to tell how we exist on these lands and why it's important that we work towards an equitable and just society.
If you're somebody who maybe looks like me or holds positions of privilege as I do, there's extra work that kind of gets layered into that. So, you know, as Anne-Marie brought up, like there are ways in which arts can be used as resistance, but not everybody uses them to do that. And so when trying to work with arts with the goal of promoting equity or dismantling inequity, there's extra care and consideration that goes into it. In my practice, some things that I've observed, and certainly some things I've learned the hard way, is that just building arts in is not inherently doing equity work if who is benefiting at the end are the same people who are benefiting from the survey tools and the quantitative tools. There's a little bit of recentering that needs to be done, especially if you're somebody like me as a consultant and an evaluator and a researcher who also like inherently benefits from being able to do this work. One, because I need to keep the lights on and food in my belly, but you know, two, because it also recenters like where I have certain privilege from being like credentials after my name and coming into these spaces. So some things that I've learned the hard way that I think are important when using arts explicitly to promote equity are, as we kind of talked earlier, like making sure that materials are accessible, or at least having conversations around who can do which things in ways that are meaningful to them. And that means being really flexible, often doing a little bit more prep work and having those conversations and not just making unilateral decisions. So sometimes it's not even for me to say what is accessible. It's like talking to people in the community, be like, what actually will make this work? And then how do we get that done? I think also like one thing that we kind of talked about and I think has come up in Anne-Marie's videos as well is that like lots of things bubble up when you give people the opportunity to share. Like we are all stories. And when we tap into them, we sometimes get more of the story than we necessarily asked for, that somebody was planning on sharing. I mean, we all have human moments of putting foot in mouth or like oversharing and then being like, oh God, okay, let's put that back in. And so one thing that I think is really important when we're then having the conversations around art and what comes up for people is like, what do they want to come up? And when there's those surprising factors, being able to anticipate, well, then who is the best person to facilitate this conversation so that it's safe if it comes up, or it can be dealt with. And there's lots of ways that, you know, communities have their own knowledge of how to do that because they've been having hard conversations before people showed up with clipboards being like, let's record this. So, you know, being able to like anticipate that when people are engaging in their stories, a lot can happen. So who's best suited to make sure that that's an okay process and not going into the extractive places of when things tend to get hard, we tend to say, oh, that's very profound. And then we slippery slope into trauma porn. So I always am really conscious, like I can only speak for myself of if I'm not necessarily a safe person to be facilitating, then I don't go there. And I kind of keep things more light. And if the goal is to go somewhere else, then I find somebody who's better suited than me to do that and step the hell back. Yeah, and then when we're playing with subversive stuff and representation, making sure that people have the right materials to do that. So even as simple as like, if you're using crayons or other tools, like does everybody get to see themselves reflected in that crayon box? And if not, then that's not the right tool to be using because we don't want to force people to, you know, have art feel bad because we didn't prepare. That's not a good time for anyone, and nobody benefits from that wisdom because it's forced and uncomfortable and not in a productively uncomfortable way that, you know, Sarah Hunt talks about, but in the like, it just sucks.
And I think it's also the how you practice, like asking questions that celebrate strengths and celebrate kind of what is working and are meaningful to those that you're asking, I think are really important when you're like creating your tools. I also think there is an acknowledgement, if you work as an evaluator in the space, like acknowledge the power and privilege you have, because in a lot of ways you're helping to decide what is success. How does it look like? What factors are we going to look for? So pay attention to that. And when there's gaps, like we're not talking to the people who know, like they're at the community, then push back in the room and say, this voice is missing. And like, how are we going to get it in a meaningful way? You know, if people don't have honorariums included in the budget, push for it, right? Because people's time is valuable. So I think sometimes as an evaluator who cannot get fired, like you have to balance it, right? Like especially as an external consultant, but I think find the ways that you can push. Look at yourself as an evaluator and like, what tools do you have? Like, do you only have surveys? Like, do you only feel good with numbers? Are you excluding other ways of knowing because you're uncomfortable? And if that's the case, like it will be hard, but do it, right? Like for your professional development, go into spaces. Like if you've never done art because it freaks you out, that used to be past me. I hear you. And professionally push yourself and do it. Like sometimes I still would rather sit behind my computer and code data because it's easier and it's simpler and I can just do it by myself and I can listen to music in my pajamas. Like I love that space, but you have to realize that's not how the whole world is, and like come in and like challenge yourself like with this collage and stuff, because I promise like you grow as an evaluator, but it also makes the evaluation more useful. And I think for me, it's like really trying to find like joyful and meaningful measurement. If evaluation can do that, then it's less of, it shouldn't feel bad. And if you're experiencing an evaluation and it does feel bad, something's wrong. It shouldn't be like that, right? And I hope that we could push against those and say like, let's evaluations be useful and not waste time. So those are some thoughts that I was, as I learned from these other two amazing people talking, it's like the energy, that's where I was thinking.
I would also add too that when going into community with wanting to work with community is to perhaps have an advisory council from people actually in the community to maybe negate some of the things that you were talking about, bringing us kind of together on understanding what the needs are and the requirements and what will work and what might not work. It's valuable. It's a shift of thinking, because if we follow the Western line and think that we know better in a patriarchal sense of white saviorism of going into communities and knowing what they want and, you know, thinking that we know everything, it's just not going to work. It doesn't work anymore. This has happened in the past. It's still happening today, but I think people are becoming more aware that, you know, whiteness is not the be all to end all, and that other knowledges and epistemological ways of being are just as valuable.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And I really appreciate the time that all three of you have taken and you sharing with all of us. We look forward to seeing what you might try out in the future.
Thanks. This was great. Thanks for sharing this space, folks.